What would you sacrifice to save your empire from a seemingly unstoppable force for Eastern Roman emperors like Theodosius II and Marcian facing Attila meant putting everything on the line, their personal safety, their immense wealth, and the very stability of their bloodline. Discover the agonizing decisions they made and the personal stakes that hung in the balance. This is the story of the Theodosian dynasty, a ruling house that tried to anchor an empire to faith, law, and walls of stone, even as the grasslands beyond the Danube produced, a power that seemed to move like weather. It is a tale that begins in an unsettled dawn when the East still believed itself secure. It narrows into the tightrope walk of Theodosius II, whose diplomacy bought peace by pouring out imperial gold. It turns sharply with Marcian, who refused to pay and dared the storm to break. It lingers on the fortifications that kept Constantinople untouched, and it ends in the long shadow of Attila, his sudden death, Rome's survival in the East, and the lessons that hardened into what would later be called Byzantium.
Welcome to the Epic History Tales channel. Subscribe to the channel if you want to watch similar videos.
Light rises over the Eastern Roman Empire in the early 5th century with deceptive calm. From the sea, Constantinople appears like a providential fortress, its harbors full, its markets loud with many tongues, its churches heavy with incense and argument. Grain arrives, taxes are gathered, edicts are proclaimed, the machinery of empire still turns. Yet beneath the marble and ceremony lies a nervous truth. This state is vast, expensive, and perpetually threatened. It must hold mountain passes in the Balkans, the river frontiers of the Danube, the desert edges of Syria, and the sea lanes that feed the capital. It must also govern not merely people, but identities, cities that remember older freedoms, armies that can make emperors, bishops who claim to speak for God. Theodosius I, the dynasty's great founder, had set the tone before this story reaches its crisis. He had fought civil wars, managed Gothic federates after the disaster at Adrianople, and most enduringly had pushed the empire toward Nicene Christianity as the definition of orthodoxy. In the East, his heirs inherited not only armies and palaces, but a moral project to present imperial rule as the guardian of true faith. Arcadius, then his son Theodosius II, presided over courts where theological disputes were not distant abstractions. They were political forces as real as legions. Emperors and empresses issued laws that shaped belief, punished heresy, elevated bishops, and stamped doctrine with the seal of the state. Yet piety did not silence the other sound at the empire's edge, the hoofbeat beyond the Danube. The world was changing. Older confederations collapsed and recombined. Peoples who had raided and traded for generations now found themselves pressed and pulled by new powers on the steppe. Roman officials had long used subsidies, treaties, and controlled violence to manage such neighbors. They could turn tribes into clients, set one against another, hire warriors as mercenaries, and buy time with gold. But this method depended on a crucial assumption that no single leader would be able to gather too many of the loose, mobile forces beyond the frontier into one obedient fist. Attila would prove that assumption fragile. He did not begin as a legend. Before his name became a curse in the streets of Thrace and a prayer in the halls of the wealthy, the Huns were already a factor, already feared, already used in Roman calculations. Roman diplomats had negotiated with Hunnic rulers before Attila rose. Roman generals had hired Hunnic horsemen to fight Roman wars. The empire knew the steppe was dangerous, but it believed danger could be measured, paid, and redirected. Attila and his brother Blida emerged as heirs to a Hunnic leadership that understood Rome's habits. They knew the empire's fear of open war, its reliance on treaties, its pride in ceremony, and its dependence on stable borders. They also knew something else, that the Eastern Empire's wealth was enormous and concentrated, and that even when it was reluctant to fight, it could always be pressured to pay. Attila's genius, as many ancient observers saw it, was not in mindless destruction, but in organization and leverage, binding together disparate groups under a single will, moving fast, striking hard, and then translating terror into tribute. The immediate danger was not theoretical. It announced itself in smoke rising from villages, in refugees crowding city gates, in anxious dispatches carried by exhausted couriers to Constantinople. The provinces along the Danube had seen raids before, but now the scale increased and the demands grew bolder. In the Eastern court, where theologians argued and scribes copied scripture, the frontier's panic became an inescapable shadow. The Theodosian rulers, guardians of an empire that called itself Roman and Christian, had to decide how to meet a power that seemed to regard treaties as tools and borders as invitations. And the question soon narrowed to one man, seated in the palace of Constantinople, facing the most perilous negotiation of his reign. Theodosius II did not look like a warlord. In the portraits and in the descriptions that survive, he appears as a ruler shaped by ceremony and learning, a man of books and prayers more than camps and marches. He came to the throne as a child in 408, and for years the empire was steered by powerful hands around him, most notably his sister Pulcheria, whose authority at court was formidable, and whose personal devotion cast a long shadow over policy. Under their rule, the Eastern Empire codified law in the Great Theodosian Code, a monumental effort to gather and clarify imperial legislation. It was a statement to the world: order could be written, preserved, and enforced. But law does not stop cavalry. As Attila's power grew, Theodosius II faced a choice that was both practical and humiliating: to buy peace with gold. Tribute was not new. Rome had long paid off threats when the alternative was ruin. Yet the sums demanded now were staggering, and the symbolism was corrosive. Each payment acknowledged that an emperor, seated on the throne of Constantine, could be compelled by a foreign king. Still, for Theodosius, the calculation was grim. A war in the Balkans could devastate provinces, disrupt tax revenue, and expose the empire to further dangers. Paying, at least, could preserve lives and buy time. Time to repair walls, to recruit, to negotiate, to survive. It was a strategy that tested Attila's patience and sharpened his appetite. Treaties were made and unmade. Demands escalated. When Roman officials hesitated or tried to cheat the terms, raids answered them. The frontier became a ledger of broken promises and burned towns. Into this tense space stepped the ambassadors. One embassy in particular, led by the Roman envoy Maximinus, would later be remembered because a man named Priscus traveled with it and wrote down what he saw. Through his account, Attila's court becomes briefly visible not as a barbaric caricature, but as a political center with its own rituals, its own hierarchy, and its own cold understanding of power. The journey itself was perilous, moving out from the familiar architecture of Roman roads and cities into a landscape where Roman authority thinned and then vanished. When the envoys reached Attila, they entered a world where the emperor's representatives were no longer masters of ceremony. They were petitioners. Attila received them with calculated restraint. He could be harsh without raising his voice, confident without ornament. He understood the theater of negotiation. The Roman envoys came with gifts and words shaped by centuries of imperial diplomacy, but they spoke to a man who did not fear their tradition. He had built a reputation long before his peak by doing what Rome dreaded most, by proving that threats could be coordinated, that raids could become campaigns, that disparate riders could become an engine of extortion. And beneath the formal exchanges lay darker currents. Ancient sources preserve the memory of plots and counterplots, including an alleged attempt by Roman officials to assassinate Attila, an episode that, whether fully as described or shaped by later retelling, captures the desperation of Theodosius's position. If Attila could not be managed by treaties alone, perhaps he could be removed, but even the suspicion of such schemes only increased the Hunnic leader's leverage. A king who could survive plots could demand more, and a court that tried and failed had to return to the table weaker than before. Gold flowed north. Theodosius's government measured out the empire's wealth in exchange for months, then years of uneasy peace. Yet the limits of this approach grew clearer with every new demand. Tribute did not create security, it created a rhythm of expectation. Each payment trained Attila's coalition to anticipate the next. Each treaty became a stepping stone to higher terms. Diplomacy, for all its sophistication, was becoming a cage. The Theodosian court could sense the trap closing. It had bought time, but time had a cost. And the cost was not only money, it was prestige, it was confidence, it was the unspoken belief that the Roman world, ordered by God and law, could not be coerced by the rider empires of the steppe. Then, in 450, the tightrope snapped, not by Attila's hand, but by fate. Theodosius II died suddenly after a riding accident, and the empire that had been balanced between tribute and terror found itself in a moment of dangerous transition. The question was no longer how Theodosius would manage Attila, but whether his successor would dare to choose a different path. Marcian came to the throne not as a child of the old imperial household, but as a soldier who had climbed through service. His elevation was tied to Pulcheria, who married him and thus provided a bridge, political, symbolic, and dynastic, between the Theodosian line and a new ruler. If Theodosius II had embodied continuity, Marcian embodied a decision. The decision was simple to state and terrifying to enact. The tribute would stop in refusing further payments. Marcian did more than change an accounting line. He challenged the logic that had governed the East's relationship with Attila for years. He risked the immediate consequence that everyone understood: an invasion. For a ruler newly enthroned, the danger was personal as well as strategic. If Attila crossed the Danube and ravaged the Balkans again, Marcian's legitimacy could be consumed in fire before it had fully settled. Yet Marcian's stance was not mere bravado. It appears in the hard light of historical reconstruction as a calculated counter-strategy. By 450, the Western Empire was unraveling under pressures the East had managed to contain. Attila's interests were turning westward, drawn by the promise of richer plunder, weaker defenses, and political chaos. The East, in Marcian's view, might endure a refusal precisely because Attila was distracted by larger ambitions, because the storm was already shifting its weight toward Italy and Gaul. There were other considerations as well. A coalition as broad as Attila's required constant reward. If Rome stopped paying, Attila could compensate by taking elsewhere, or his followers might question him. Marcian may have understood that the Hunnic Empire, for all its menace, was not a permanent state with settled institutions. It was a structure held together by a leader's success. Deny the gold, and the structure might creak. The consequences of defiance were immediate in atmosphere, if not in battle. The frontier commanders would have tightened their watch. The Danubian towns would have remembered earlier devastation and prepared for worse. In Constantinople, the court's calm ceremonies would have been haunted by the possibility of sudden disaster. Marcian's refusal was a thrown spear that could not be called back. It forced Attila to respond, and the empire waited to see whether the Hunnic king would turn his full attention eastward to punish this insolence, or whether other temptations would pull him away. That tension, stretching across rivers and seasons, drew attention to a fact often overlooked in stories dominated by raids and negotiations. While emperors paid and argued, they also built. Quietly, steadily, the Theodosian state had been turning its wealth into walls. The Danubian frontier, the old limes that had defined Rome's northern edge for centuries, was not abandoned even in years of tribute. Forts were repaired, garrisons were shifted, cities in the Balkans, scarred by earlier attacks, became points of stubborn defense rather than open invitations. The empire could not seal the entire border against fast-moving horsemen, but it could make incursions costlier, slower, less certain. Deterrence was not a single wall, it was a network of obstacles that forced an invader to spend time, and time was what the Roman state needed most. Above all, there was Constantinople. The Theodosian walls rose in massive tiers of stone and brick, their lines cutting across the peninsula like an answered prayer. Begun earlier in Theodosius II's reign and strengthened over time, they were not merely fortifications. They were an argument carved into the landscape. The capital was not a frontier town to be terrorized, but a citadel meant to outlast sieges, to resist panic, to endure. When earthquakes damaged portions of the defenses, rapid repairs were ordered. The city understood, with an instinct deeper than ideology, that its survival depended on stone as much as sanctity. These walls also changed strategy. An emperor behind them could afford patience. Even if the Balkans burned, Constantinople could remain a functioning heart, a place where money could still be minted, armies still organized, diplomacy still conducted. The walls gave the East a resilience the West increasingly lacked. They offered a center that could not easily be decapitated. Attila, for all his audacity, never attempted to storm Constantinople. Ancient writers and later historians have debated why. Perhaps he recognized that his forces, built for speed and open battle, were ill-suited to a prolonged siege against layered defenses. Perhaps he judged that the prize was not worth the cost, or that Roman naval power and supply lines would frustrate him. Whatever the reason, the walls stood as a boundary not only of stone, but of strategic possibility. They did not save every village on the frontier, but they ensured that the empire's core could not be taken in a single catastrophic blow. This is why direct confrontations between Attila and the Eastern Empire often appear limited and indirect compared to the dramatic set-piece battles associated with the West. The East did fight when forced, and it suffered grievously in raids, but its overarching method under Theodosius II and Marcian was a blend of deterrence, selective engagement, and diplomacy, sometimes humiliating, sometimes daring, always shaped by the goal of preserving the state. It was not the romance of heroic charges, it was the grim arithmetic of survival. And as Marcian held his refusal as the walls stood and the Danube forts watched the horizon, Attila's attention surged toward the west, where the prizes were easier and the political fractures deeper. The Eastern Empire, bruised but intact, would soon see how differently the same threat could play out across the old Roman world. In the West, the Roman imperial system was thinning to a shadow. Power had fragmented among generals, court factions, and barbarian kingdoms that were no longer merely federate allies but rivals and successors. When Attila moved into Gaul and later threatened Italy, the Western Empire faced him with a mixture of desperation and improvisation, relying on alliances that revealed its weakness. The East, by contrast, still possessed a commanding capital, a functioning bureaucracy, and the ability to concentrate resources behind defensible lines. This contrast does not mean the Eastern strategy was effortless or morally clean. Paying tribute was costly and controversial. Refusing tribute was perilous. The Balkans suffered repeatedly, and the people who lived closest to the frontier paid the price in ruined farms, emptied villages, and lives uprooted. Yet in the cold balance of history, the Eastern Empire did not collapse under the Hunnic pressure as the Western Empire would later collapse under a combination of forces, including the aftershocks that Attila's campaigns helped intensify. Then, abruptly, the menace broke. Attila did not die in battle against Rome. He died in 453, suddenly on a night that ancient sources describe with grim drama in the midst of celebration and marriage. The details are debated, filtered through hostile accounts and the fog of rumor. Some speak of a hemorrhage, others shape the tale into moralizing legend. What remains consistent is the consequence. The center could not hold. After Attila, the Hunnic Empire fractured. It had been an edifice built around a singular personality, held together by fear, reward, and momentum. Without him, rivalries surfaced, subordinate groups broke away, and the confederation that had seemed unstoppable began to dissolve into smaller powers. For the Eastern Empire, this was not merely relief. It was a vindication of endurance. The years of tribute, the years of rebuilding, the refusal under Marcian, each policy, however contested at the time, had been a wager on one fundamental belief that the Roman state could outlast the storm. Marcian's reign continued for only a few years after Attila's death. But the strategic posture hardened into tradition. Future Eastern emperors would face new nomadic threats, different names, different banners, the same fundamental challenge of speed, surprise, and extortion. The methods refined under the Theodosians would persist, diplomacy backed by credible defenses, the use of gold not as surrender alone, but as a tool to shape enemy behavior. The strengthening of fortifications and the careful management of frontier provinces, the understanding that the empire's greatest weapon was its ability to survive setbacks without losing its center. The Theodosian dynasty's legacy is therefore not confined to a family line that ended, or to laws collected in codices, or to councils that defined doctrine. It lies in a particular kind of imperial resilience. The Theodosians helped create a state that could absorb disaster on its edges while remaining coherent at its heart. They presided over an empire that defined itself as Christian and Roman, yet learned to negotiate with powers that did not share its language, its faith, or its concept of civilization. They ruled at a moment when the old world was breaking apart, and their choices, humiliating, bold, cautious, and severe, kept the Eastern Empire alive. In the final image, the camera of history pulls back from the Danube frontier, from the burned fields and repaired forts, from the uneasy embassies and the chests of gold counted out for peace. It rises above Constantinople, where the Theodosian walls still cast long shadows, where domes and towers gleam under a cold sun. Attila is gone, his empire scattered like dust across the grasslands. The Western Empire will stagger on for a time before it finally falls. But in the East, the Roman state endures, tempered by fear, disciplined by necessity, and fortified by the hard lessons learned when a dynasty met the storm and refused to be